Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am DM Bluddworth, and as you can see by the graphics, today's video is Dragon Magazine CD Archive. This is the 150 issue 5-disc set that I picked up a couple of weeks ago. And as I said in a previous video, I was going to do a randomized selection from each disc and just pull up a Dragon magazine and then flip through it and perhaps focus on a particular article that really stood out to me, and just go from there and really try to keep it random, so that it's as unscripted as possible, and you're getting my first reaction of looking at some of these magazines that I haven't quite, frankly, seen in literally decades. A few of them I've actually not seen at all because they were in the earlier portion of Dragon Magazine. So I don't believe I started following the magazine until either 79 or certainly by the 80s. I was either picking up some of them myself, or my dungeon master Adam was certainly collecting them on a very regular basis, and so we kind of shared copies. So some of them I'm not familiar with at all, and others, especially going from the 80s on, really will stand out to me and be a real, nostalgic look at them. That being said, this is the third time I'm trying to do this video. The first time I didn't get the PDF aligned with actually broadcasting, and I spent, a good 25 minutes with you looking at a blank screen as I was going through the PDF. So I made it another second run this morning, and once I started checking the audio of it, for some reason the audio was popping and just hanging up and here and there. And even though it's not online, so I really shouldn't have had a connectivity problem. Who the hell knows? So what I'm doing now is I'm removing the randomness of it out as far as what you're seeing on the screen. I'm still going to randomly select the issues that I'm going to showcase, and then I will pick out the actual article that I'm going to focus on. But if you have any suggestion with that particular magazine that you really want me to go over in detail, because I will detail the entire table of contents. If you want me to focus on a different part, then just leave that in the comments, and I will get around to actually focusing on that particular article after I've read it fully and gone over it. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm not going to do a video for all 250 issues. I'm probably going to do probably 3 from each disc. So the first disc has 80, so I'm going to do 3 that are randomly generated by me, and then 1 that that a subscriber has suggested. So this first one I'm going to be doing issue number 24. Remarkably, it actually came up on my random dice roller twice. So the first time that I tried to run it, it was issue 24. The second time I'm trying to run it, it was issue 24. And now this is the third time I'm just staying with it because it's already on there. But just as a small shout out to the dice roller that I use Lion's Den. So it's an app that you can just put in any of the polyhedrons that you want, or you can create them. So I just did a DX80, and that will give me a D80. And then when I roll this, I would have done 45, but instead I'm already preset to do 24, and so that's where I'm going to move on to. So without further ado, let's take a look at issue 24. So here we have Dragon Magazine, issue number 24. It's labeled as Volume 3, number 10, April 1979, for $2. I do not know who the original artist is, it's kind of hard to tell, and I don't recall seeing it anywhere else. But the cover is for Lost Civilizations. This is a fantasy supplement for the Source of the Nile. So the Source of the Nile was a precursor role-playing game that came out of the Blackmore group, and it came before Dungeons and Dragons, and you're going to see something in this particular issue, and most likely the other earlier issues. And this particular issue actually focuses quite a bit on tabletop war games, and just articles that are related to that portion of the hobby. So even now in 1979, there's still a lot of crossover between tabletop wargaming and Dungeons and Dragons. So that's the cover. Pretty cool. Looks like a water ink, kind of cover. I'm not crazy about the dragon font, because later on you'll see it becomes very difficult to actually read. They were pitching Gen Con 12 at the time. So this was held at the University of Wisconsin Parkside. Now I went to Gen Con 18, so yeah, that kind of makes sense, because that was in 1985. So here's the contents, and I'm going to go through these, and I'm going to focus on the one that I'm actually going to spend the most time with. So we have the Lost Civilization. We have a Viking campaign in the Caspian Sea. We have Out on a Limb, which is the letters from from readers, and then I guess the editors will read those back and answer to them. We have the Feature Creature Contest, number 2 winners. We have the Society for Creative Anachronism. We have Keeping the Magic User in His Place. That's another article that I could really focus on, and maybe I will go back to that later on, but that's not the one I'm actually going to focus on. You have the Roman Military Organization's Classic Warfare Updated. The Sorcerer's Scroll, the Melee in D&D, that's the one I am going to focus on, and that's obviously by Gary Gygax. So all of the Sorcerer's Scrolls, at least initially, I believe were all from Gary Gygax. So these are just his impressions or his interpretations of the game that he created. So, they do carry quite a lot of weight. Now that I have all 250 magazines, I'm going to probably print out just the Sorcerer's Scrolls sections, so I can have that in a separate file, a separate printed out booklet, possibly create a booklet for personal use and just personal reading pleasure. The ramifications of alignment, again, I could spend probably an entire video just on that, or probably a video series on that. In Defense of Extraordinary Characters, again, another interesting topic. Chinese Dragons, which most likely end up in the not Unearthed Arcana, I'm sorry, and Oriental Adventures a bit later on. Another look at lycanthropy. Dungeon. Psionics Revisited. Was never a big fan of psionics, so I probably won't revisit it. Disease, Removing Ambiguity, so I will take a look at that. Naming Things and EPT, I'm not quite sure what that is. Gen Con Update, Con News. The Narcissist, a humorous PC type, we all know. The Infamous Miscellaneous Monster. Monty Hall, The Best of Freddy. And background is Armies of the Renaissance, Part 2, The Swiss. The Roots of Myth. So and obviously the publisher is Gary Gygax, or Gary Gygax. This is the father, not the junior. The managing editor is Tim Kask. LW editor is Joe Orlowski. Sorry about that. The art department is Dave Sutherland and Tom Wham. And some others. Like I said, I don't quite know who did the front cover. I wish I did. So the Lost Civilizations, which is another article you really should take a look at. This was Ross Maker and David Wesley's exciting Source of the Nile game. So really should take a look at that. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to try to get my hands on that because that really is a piece of just role-playing history. So I have to get my hands on it. I already bought some of the supporting books that was behind The Secret of Blackmore. So I want to focus on this. This is by J. Eric Holmes as well. So I think that's an important thing to consider. The fact that he wrote the second edition of Dungeons and Dragons, the basic Dungeons and Dragons, kind of cleaned it up from OD&D. Here as a supplement, I think is important. But let's get to the article I was going to spend time with. Judges Guild back in 1979, so pretty cool. How far back in the history they actually went. This is that Viking campaign idea, and so you can see they're laying it all out here with maps, and you could certainly pull these things and utilize them in your own campaign. So it's but you could see that real connection to tabletop wargaming. You can see here. So from the Sorcerer's Scroll, the Melee in D&D by Gary Gygax. There is some controversy regarding the system of resolving individual battles used in Dungeons & Dragons and the somewhat similar Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Melee system. The meat of D&D is the concept of pure adventure, the challenge of the unknown, facing the unexpected and overcoming all obstacles. At times, this requires combat with spell, missile, and hand-to-hand fighting. How crucial to the game as a whole is the melee? What part should it play? Is realism an important consideration? To put the whole matter into perspective, it is necessary to point out that there is probably only a small percentage of the whole concerned with possible shortcomings in the melee system, but even 1% to perhaps 5% of an audience of well over 100,000 enthusiasts is too large a number to be totally ignored. I'm just going to make this a little bit larger so that I can see it, and you can probably see it a little better as well. All right, so here we are. What part should we play? Is realism an important consideration? To put the whole matter into perspective, all right, as I read, up to 100,000 enthusiasts, it's too large to be ignored. To the majority, I'll do it this way. I'll highlight it so I can read it better and you can see what I'm reading. To the majority who do not have problems with the rationale of fantasy melee as presented in D&D, that follows will serve to strengthen your understanding. What follows will serve to strengthen your understanding of the process or processes and their relationship to the whole game. For those who doubt the validity of Dungeons & Dragons combat system, the exploitation will at least demonstrate the logic of the systems and perhaps justify them to the extent that you will be able to use them with complete assurance that there are faithful representations of the combat potential of the figures concerned. Okay. There can be no question as to the central theme of the game. It is the creation and development of the game persona, the fantastic player character who is to interact with his or her environment, hopefully to develop into a commanding figure in the milieu. In order to do so, the player character must undergo a continuing series of activities which are dictated by the campaign at large and the dungeon master in particular. Interaction can be the mundane affairs of food, equipment, and shelter, or it can be dealing with non-player characters in only slightly less routine things such as hiring the men at arms, treating with local officials, and so on. But from even these everyday affairs can develop adventures. And adventures are, of course, the meat of Dungeons and Dragons. For it is by means of adventuring that the player characters gain acumen and the wealth and wherewithal to increase their ability level. The experience, actual and the awarded by the DM, is gained in the course of successive adventures, and it is most common to engage in combat. Hacking and slewing, maybe that meant to be slaying, I'm not sure. Hacking and slewing should not, of course, be the first refuge of the beleaguered Dungeons and Dragoner, let alone his or her initial resort when confronted with a problem situation. Naturally enough, a well-run campaign will offer a sufficient number of alternatives as well as situations which encourage thinking, negotiation, and alternatives to physical force by means of careful prompting or object lessons in the negative form. Aside from this, however, combat and melee will certainly occupy a considerable amount of time during any given adventure, at least on the average. Spell and missile combat do not consume an appreciable amount of time, but as they are often a part of an overall melee, these factors must be considered along with hand-to-hand fighting. All right, let me highlight it because I'm doing better with highlighting it than I am without. What must be simulated in melee combat are the thrusts and blows, smashing and cutting of weapons wielded, as well as natural body weaponry of monsters, teeth and claws, and so forth. Individual combat of this sort can be made exceptionally detailed by inclusion of such factors as armor, weapon, reflex speed, agility, position of weapon, left or right hand or both, training, strength, height, weight, tactics chosen, attack, defend, or in a combination, location of successful blows, and the result of injury to specific areas. If in fact D&D were a game of simulation of hand-to-hand combat utilizing miniature figurines, such detail would be highly desirable. The game is one of adventure, though, and the combats of protected nature, several hours minimum of 6 or more player characters are considered involved against one or more opponents each, are undesirable, and the majority of the participants are most definitely not miniature battle game enthusiasts. Time could be reduced considerably by inclusion of such factors as death blows, a kill at a single stroke, exceptionally high amounts of damage, a modified form of killing at a single stroke, specific hit location coupled with specific body hit points, and special results from hits, unconscious, loss of member, incapacitation of member, etc. All right, so basically he's saying that the system is not really designed to be a true simulation of a real combat, that there has to be some amount of streamlining, unless of course you want to get that deeply involved in individual combats. Close simulation of actual hand-to-hand combat and inclusion of immediate result strokes have overall disadvantages from the standpoint of the game as a whole. Obviously, much of the excitement and action is not found in Melee, and even excitement and action is not found in Melee, and even shortening the process by adding the death strokes and the like causes undue emphasis on such combat. Furthermore, D&D is a role-playing campaign game where much of the real enjoyment comes from participation from the gradual development of the game persona, their gradual development and their continuing exploits, whether successes or failures, in a system already fraught with the numerous possibilities of instant death, spell, poison, breath weapons, and gaze weapons. I see what I'm doing wrong here. Let's see. Breath and gaze weapons, and traps. It is too much to force players to face yet another. Melee combat is nearly certainly to be a part of each, and this is where something happens. It skips over, so I don't know if there was a piece missing, but it does go from page 17 to 18, but something, possibly responsibility of the character death, highly likely, but it also allows the wise to withdraw if things get too tough, most of the time in any case. I'm going to have to try to fill in the blank there. I think what was said was melee combat is nearly certainly to be a part of each and every. It's probably a campaign or adventure, and then there, an obvious combat encounter, and the responsibility of the character death, or possibility of character death, is highly likely. All right, that's what it should be. Possibility of character death is highly likely, but it's also wise to withdraw if things get too tough, most of the time in any case. So this really resonates with me today, because we just had this conversation in in my video last night, along with Vince and and the Jeff, and we were talking about and confronting some ideas about combat and storytelling and narrative and such, and it really does lie into this, where we had come to the consensus last night that you're not going to individualize every single sword swing, and Gary talks about that as well here, but perhaps focus on just the critical successes and the critical failures. So the critical hits and the fumbles is where you'll actually go into more focus on. And so that's what they're talking about here, or Gary is talking about here. And he certainly goes into it in a bit more detail, which I will absolutely focus on. The D&D combat systems are not all that unrealistic either. As will be discussed hereafter, the systems are designed to provide a relative speed of resolution without either bogging the referee in a morass of paperwork or giving high probability of death to participants' persona. Certainly, the longer and more involved the melee procedure, the more work and boredom from the dungeon master, while fast systems are fun but deadly to player characters if such systems are challenging and equitable. and tend to discourage participants from long-term commitments to a campaign, for they cannot relate to a world in which they are but a briefest candles, so to speak. So yeah, he's basically saying if your campaign is too deadly, the players are not going to buy in because they're never going to have a chance to really get to know their characters and start to develop them over time. They're just not going to have that care for them. But if the combat is too lenient and there's very little danger, then they're also going to grow bored and disengage from the campaign as well. So in order to minutely examine the D&D combat system as used in the advanced game, an example of play is appropriate, considering a party of adventurers trekking through a dungeon's 10-foot wide corridor when they come upon a chamber housing a troop of gnoll guards. Let us assume that the party of adventurers is both well balanced in character, race, and class. They have a dwarf, a gnome, and a halfling in the front rank. Behind them are 2 half-elves. The last rank consists of 3 humans. Although there are 8 characters, all of them are able to take an active part in the coming engagement. Spells and missiles can be discharged from the rear or the middle rows. The center rank characters will also be able to engage in hand-to-hand combat if they have equipped themselves with spears or thrusting polearms, which are the size useful in the surroundings. The front rank can initially use spells or missiles and then engage in melee with middle ranks support, assuming that the party was not surprised. Whether or not any exchange of missiles or spells takes place is immaterial to the example, for it is melee which is the activity in question. Let us then move on to where the adventurers are locked in combat with the gnolls. Okay. Each melee round is considered to be 1 minute time period, with a further division into 10 segments of 6 seconds each for determination of missile fire, spell casting, and the striking of multiple telling blows. Note that during the course of the round, there are assumed to be a number of parries, feints, and non-telling attacks made by opponents. The one or several dice roll or rolls made for each adventurer, however, determines if a telling attack is made. If there is a hit indicated, some damage has been done. If a miss is rolled, then the opponents manage to block or avoid the attack. If the participants picture the melee as somewhat analogous to boxing match, they will have a correct grasp of the rationale used to designing the melee system. During the course of the melee round, there is a movement. There are many attacks which do not score, and each to-hit roll dice indicates that there is an opening which may or may not allow a telling attack. In a recent letter, Don Turnbull stated that he envisioned that the 3 sorts of attacks were continually taking place during melee. Attacks which had no chance of hitting, including feints and parries and the like. Attacks which had a chance of doing damage, but which missed as indicated by the die roll, and attacks which were telling, as indicated by the die roll and subsequent damage determined. This is a correct summation of the D&D melee procedure subsumes. Note that the skill factor of a higher level of higher level fighters, as well as natural abilities and or speed of some monsters, allow more than one opportunity per round of scoring a telling attack, as they are more able to take advantage of openings left by their adversaries during the course of sparring. Similarly, zero-level men and monsters under one full hit die are considered as being less able to defend, thus opponents of 2 or more levels of hit dice are able to get in one telling blow at each such level or hit die. I'm trying to decipher that. I'm thinking that what he's saying is that you get multiple attacks on less than one hit die, regardless of, as long as you have, I guess, 2 or more hit die, you get additional attacks. At least that's what I'm getting from that passage. This melee system also hinges on the number of hit points assigned to characters. All right, so let me... As I have repeatedly pointed out, if a rhino can take a maximum amount of damage equal to 8 of 9 8-sided dice, a maximum of 64 to 72 hit points of damage to kill, it is positively absurd to assume that an 8th level fighter with an average score on his or her hit dice and a constitution of 18, thus having 76 hit points, can physically withstand more punishment than a rhino before being killed. Hit points are a combination of actual physical condition, skill at the avoidance of taking real physical damage, luck and or magical or divine factors. Now, that's really interesting because that's exactly what Legion of Myth was talking about, or at least having a discussion about hit points in, in role-playing games and what they really mean. And here Gary is clearly saying that the hit points of a character are not all physical. They're the other abilities to avoid taking damage or magical or divine factors are into play. And he goes further into describing how that actually, what the rationale behind that is. And that's where we're going to go. 10 points of damage dealt to the rhino indicate a considerable wound, while the same damage sustained by an 8th level fighter indicates a near miss, a slight wound, or a bit of a luck used up, a bit of fatigue piling up against his or her skill at avoiding the fatal cut or thrust. So even when a hit is scored in melee combat, it is more often than not a grazing blow, a scratch, a mere light wound, which would have been fatal or nearly so to a lesser mortal. If sufficient numbers of these such wounds accrue to the character, however, stamina, skill, and luck will eventually run out and an attack will strike home. I am firmly convinced, let me highlight it. We'll go down to that. I am firmly convinced that this system is superior to all others so far conceived and published. It reflects actual combat reasonably for weaponry, armor, protection and speed and magical factors, skill level, and allows for a limited amount of choice as to attacking or defending. It does not require participants to keep track of more than a minimal amount of information. It is quite fast, and it does not place undue burdens or burden upon the dungeon master. It allows those involved in the combat to opt to retire if they are taking too much damage, although this does not necessarily guarantee that they will succeed or that the opponents will not strike a telling blow prior to such retreat. Means of dealing fatal damage at a single stroke or melee routine are kept to a minimum commensurate with the excitement level of the system. Poison, weapons which deliver a fatal blow, etc., are rare or obvious. Thus, participants know that a giant snake or scorpion can fell with a single strike with poison. A dragon or a 12-headed hydra or a cloud giant deliver considerable amounts of damage when they succeed in striking, and they are also aware that it is quite unlikely that an opponent will have a sword of sharpness, a vorpal blade, or some similar deadly weapon. Melee, then, albeit a common enough occurrence, is a calculated risk which participants can usually determine in before engaging in and to their likelihood of success. And even if the hazards are found to be too severe, they can often retract their characters to fight another day. All right, so basically, he's saying that the players with experience are going to be able to pick up on these cues in combat. They're going to notice a dagger is dripping with venom, or that they're fighting a giant scorpion that has that potential of striking a killing strike with one strike, or a dragon that can obviously use its breath weapon and potentially wipe out an entire party. And provided they have initiative, they should really make the decision um, to not engage, to try to sneak away, to even run, as opposed to taking on a challenge that they believe might be a near death or almost certain death experience. Now, I would argue that should they still do, because maybe they're compelled, that is the final boss. And so that is just going to make their encounter that much more heroic, because they're going forward, and and despite the risk, they're still moving forward with the combat. Of course, everyone will not be satisfied with the D&D combat system. If a DM and the players desire a more complex and time-consuming method of determining melee combat, or if they wish a more detailed but shorter system, who can say them nay? However, care must be taken to make certain that the net effect is the same as if the correct system had been employed, or else the melee will become imbalanced. If combat is distorted to favor the player characters, experience levels will rise too rapidly, and the participants will become bored with the game, which other offers no real challenge and whose results are always a foregone conclusion. If the melee is changed to favor the adversaries of player characters, such as by the inclusion of these extra or special damage when a high number is rolled to the hit die, the results will also be a loss of interest in the campaign. Let me highlight this so we have it. How does a double damage on the die score of a 20 favor monsters and spoil a campaign? You ask. If only players are allowed such extra damage, then the former case of imbalance in favor of the players over the adversaries is in effect. If monsters are allowed such a benefit, it means that the chances of surviving the melee or without such a benefit, drawing from combat, if they are not going well, are sharply reduced. In other words, if you just give it to the players, then they have an advantage and makes combat very easy for them. If you give it to both the players and the monsters, then the monsters have a good chance of potentially killing the players with one strike. And he's basically saying you just have to be mindful of these things when you're deciding whether or not to use it one way or the other, or for just one side but not the other, and just be aware that you could run into either problem. He's not quite saying not to do this. He's just saying that it's you just have to be mindful that it could alter the balance of the nature of the combat. So if players cannot develop and identify with a long-lived character, they will lose interest in the game. Terry Kuntz developed a system which allowed for telling strokes in an unpublished game he developed to create an epic adventures of Robin Hood et al. To mitigate against the loss at a single stroke, he also included saving throws which allowed avoidance of such death blows. And saving throw increased as the characters successfully engaged in combats, gained experience, and so forth. This sort of approach is obviously possible, but it requires a highly competent designer to develop. They basically have this, right? So if your character has a high constitution, then their system shock percentages are really quite high. So it certainly is something that's kind of built into the system, where especially advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where it's built into the system where very powerful characters, very tough characters, are in fact harder to kill. Melee in Dungeons and Dragons is certainly a crucial factor, and it must not be warped at risk of spoiling the whole game. Likewise, it is not unrealistic. If there is such a thing as realism in a game, particularly a game filled with unreal assumptions of dragons and magic spells and so on, the D&D melee combat systems subsumes all sorts of viable factors in a system which must deal with imaginary monsters, magic empowered, endowed weaponry, and make-believe characters and abilities. It does so in a form as to allow referees to handle the affair as rapidly as possible while keeping balance between player characters and opponents and still allowing the players the chance of withdrawing their characters if the going gets too tough or too rough. As melee combat is so common an occurrence during the course of each adventure, brevity, equitability, and options must be carefully balanced. Someone recently asked how I could include a rule regarding weapons proficiency in the advanced game after decrying what they viewed as a similar system bonuses for expertise with weapons. The AD&D system, in fact, penalizes characters using weapons which they do not have expertise with. Obviously, this is entirely different effect upon combat. Penalties do not change balance between character and adversary, for the player can always opt to use non-penalized weapons for his or her character. It also makes the game more challenging by further defining differences in character classes and causing certain weapons to be more desirable. Will the magic hammer +1 be useful to a cleric? It is likewise adds choices. All this rather than offering still another method whereby characters can more easily defeat opponents and have less challenge. How can one be mistaken as a variation of the other? The answer there is the results. The two systems were not reflected upon. With a more perfect understanding of the combat system and the purposes, the inquirer will certainly be able to reason the thing through without difficulty and avoid spoiling the game in the name of realism. Let's go to about here, I guess. Realism does not have a function in Dungeons and Dragons, of course. It is a tool of the DM when confronting with a situation which is not covered by the rules. With a number of variables involved in a game of such as Dungeons and Dragons, there is no possibility of avoiding situations which are not spelled out in the book. The spirit of the rules can be used as a guideline, as can the overall aim of the rules, which apply to general cases. But when a specific situation arises, judgment must often be brought into play. Sean Cleary pointed this out to me in a letter commenting on common misunderstandings and difficulties encountered by the DM. While the advanced system will make it absolutely clear that clerics, for example, have but one chance to attempt to turn undead, and that there is no saving throw for those struck by undead, life level is drained, there is no possibility of including minutiae in the rules. To illustrate further, consider the example of missile fire into melee. Generally, the chances of hitting a friend instead of a foe is a ratio of 2 in the chances of hitting a friend or foe is a ratio of 2 in the melee. That's missing a word there. Maybe 2 in 1. With small foes, the ratio is adjusted accordingly, and 2 humans fighting 4 kobolds gives about equal possibilities of hitting either. Huge foes make it almost impossible to strike a friend. Aiming at a 12-foot tall giant upper torso is quite unlikely to endanger the 6-foot tall human of a javelin of lightning bolts. All right, so yeah, you kind of have to make these judgments as a DM as to what are the possibilities of an attack going so far awry that you hit one of your own members. And in some cases, as he points out, if you're fighting something that is of very, very large size, the chances of you hitting them could be next to zero. In that comparison. So into a melee where a human and a giant are engaged. The missile strikes the giant. Where does its stroke of lightning travel? Common sense and reality indicate that the angle of the javelin when it is struck the giants will dictate that stroke will travel in a straight line back along the shaft, and the rest is a matter of typical positions and angles. If the human was generally before the giant and the javelin was thrown from behind the human, the trajectory of the missile will be relatively straight line, ending in the shaft of the weapon and indicating the course of the bolt lightning backwards. The giant's human opponent will not be struck by the stroke, but the lightning will come closer most probably. Therefore, if the human is in metal armor, a saving throw should be made to determine if he or she takes half or no damage. He goes a little bit more on to just going into more like specific categories, and I want to get back to the theory. So I'm going to skip over some of this here. Actually, we're almost done, but the melee system used in Dungeons and Dragons, I'm going to skip over the saving throw part and the numbers part. Let's take a look at here. The melee system used in the Dungeons and Dragons are by no means sacrosanct. Changes can be made if they are done intelligently by a knowledgeable individual who thoroughly understands the whole design. Similarly, realism is a part of melee, for the DM must refer to continually to the adjudicate combat situations where no rules exist, and this handling is the utmost importance in maintaining a balanced melee procedure. With this truly important input from the referee, it may it is my firm belief that the D&D system of combat is not only adequate but actually unsurpassed by any of its rivals' so-called improvements and the realistic methods. The latter add complication, unnecessary record keeping, or otherwise distort the aim of the role-playing game: character survival and identification. What is foisted off on the gullible is typically a hodgepodge of arbitrary rulings which are claimed to give realism to a make-believe game. Within the scope of the whole game surrounding such systems, they might or might not work well enough, but seldom will these systems fit into D&D regardless of the engineering attempts of the well-meaning referees. The logic of the D&D melee system is simple. They reasonably reflect fantastic combat and they work damn well from all standpoints. My advice is to leave well enough alone and accept the game for what it is. If you must have more detail in melee, switch to another game, for the combat portions of D&D are integral, and unsuccessful attempts to change melee will result in spoiling the whole. Better to start fresh than to find that much time and effort has been wasted on a dead-end variant. So, he pretty much laid it out there. A few additional words. Those of you who read the first article in the series Dungeons & Dragons, What is It and Where It Is Going, Dragon number 22, will appreciate knowing that TSR is now in the process of creating its design department. Gene Wells is now on the staff in order to give the game material with a feminine viewpoint. Oh my gosh, he's including women in 1979. After all, at least 10% of the players are female. Lawrence Schick also joined us recently, and he will work primarily with science fantasy and science fiction role-playing adventure game material, although you'll undoubtedly be seeing his name on regular D&D and AD&D items as well. So there's that, inclusivity that we've been hearing so often did not exist in Gary Gygax's mind at the time. Incredible article, so much in there, a lot to unpack, and just so many different aspects of combat that become something that you really have to think about. And so I encourage you to try to get your hands on any of these writings. I'm sure that you could probably find them online, where there's various articles or Gary Gygax's writings, so that you can actually see what he thought about gaming and various aspects of Dungeons and Dragons and go into greater detail. That's if you don't have all of these. Like I said, I am going to certainly just copy out all of these particular sections of all 250, and I'm going to print them out and bind them somehow and just have them as just a wealth of information. It doesn't mean I'm going to agree with everything that he says or utilize everything that he wrote, but I'm certainly going to take the gems out of it and utilize those. So and it's just so curious that this is the issue that came up twice, and that's the article that just drew my attention to, because I've been having these conversations over these last 2 or 3 weeks where all of these things have been coming up, all right, as far as like hit points and of combat, and when do you focus on, giving more detail in the description. And I've been considering looking at some of the rules. Like I think that the double damage of point blank missile fire is ridiculously overpowered, and so I'm looking at other ways of dealing with that. And there were two other articles in this particular Dragon Magazine number 24, uh, that could potentially have a similar impact in just changing the way you think about the game based on views of Dungeons and Dragons. So I hope you like this video. I certainly it doesn't have any of the audio glitches and such. And again, I hope you like. Give it a thumb. If you have questions or comments, leave them in. There's a magazine to focus Dragon magazines through 80 or a specific article. Then just leave that in the comment section, and perhaps if I get several of them, it might be one of those that I actually highlight. So kind of a subscriber's choice or article on do and I of told video once again we can gaming on the screen